Warm welcome to the IES Autumn 2015 lecture series. This series is exploring EU in international institutions and its performance in international institutions. Professor Jamal Shaheen, who is here sitting in the front row, has been arranging this, and what we've been doing is that we've been exploring EU's performance, EU in different international settings, different international institutions, and how EU is performing. My name is Harri Kalem. I'm a professor here at the IES, working in the environment and sustainable development cluster, as well as in the economic governance cluster, so in two clusters. And it's my great pleasure to have with me here tonight Ms. Monika Henksee, who is coming directly from Paris yesterday from COP21, where she has been dealing with this very issue on the spot, as well as the 11th meeting, which she will be telling about in just a moment. She's a head of unit in the Commission's DG Trade, responsible, the lead negotiator for the EGA, for the Environmental Goods Agreement, on behalf of the EU at the moment. So she has the insight into what is going on in these negotiations at the moment, and that is indeed the case study that we have here today. Joachim Reiter, who was also supposed to be here, is stuck in Paris, not for the train, but because of the meetings there taking place. We tried to arrange his participation even over Skype, but even that turned out to be difficult, so he sent his best regards to everybody and really apologized deeply for not being able to come here for tonight as he had hoped to do and be here with us. That being said, let us launch with the today's discussion. So, what we're trying to do here today is to look into the EU as an actor in the WTO, and because the WTO agenda has been relatively, let's say, quiet recently, I decided that we could pick up the Environmental Goods Agreement as something that is actually moving. The agenda, the EGA, in fact, combines, in a way, two policy fields where the European Union is an actor and is active. On the one hand, of course, trade as WTO, and on the other hand, of course, the environment. And because we are combining two policy fields, what I'll try to do here first is to give you a quick outline of these two fields. What does it mean for the EU? What does EU do in these two fields? And then I'll combine the two, show how they merge together in complicated ways, and how, in particular, in WTO, these two policy fields, that of trade and that of environment, actually merge. And at that point, I will then hand over to Monika so that she can use the EGA as our case study, as our example of really exploring this intricate relationship between trade and environment within the context of the WTO. So, what is EU and trade? In simple terms, of course, trade and free movement of goods and services has been the ethos of EU all along. We are the children of free movement. Four freedoms have been on the agenda of EU from the outset, and therefore, of course, it's normal that on the outside world as well, we are promoting the same ethos. And practically speaking, this means that the EU has a common commercial policy, CCP, and this is something which over the course of years has been a little bit discussed about who is really the actor here, in fact, in Europe. Is it the EU or the member states? And this is one of the fields which from the outset has been mostly dedicated to the exclusive competence of the European Union. There are some fringe issues, such as certain areas of intellectual property rights, for example, some cultural issues, some audiovisual media questions, which fall outside of the scope of exclusivity, but by and large, we can say that the EU itself, it's the EU that is running the trade agenda as far as EU is concerned. The actors in the question are such that Commission, in particular, after the Lisbon Treaty's strengthening of the EU's role, the Commission's role in the outside agenda, is clearly the leading institution in that it is conducting the negotiations on the trade issues, but one can note also that the Parliament's role has become more pervasive since the changes in Lisbon, and that may have, of course, a consequence in terms of what kind of policies the EU is conducting, in particular with respect to environment, because the Parliament has been known for being a relatively green institution in the EU's setup. Now, internationally speaking, of course, one can say that the European Union is a very big player. It has a prominent role internationally. Why? Well, on the one hand, it creates a benchmark in terms of how a free trade regime works. Simply the single market in itself provides examples of how you can actually promote trade, how you can actually open up the markets very prominently. How do you actually get rid of tariffs, etc.? So it's a benchmark. It has been leading the way. But more importantly, perhaps lately, it's an international actor which, simply due to its huge size as a trading bloc, has a lot of clout on international arena. It is the biggest trading bloc in the world, and that gives it a leverage in a way which is important. It's a major voice in international trade agenda. The way in which EU has been functioning is that it can, on the one hand, has a lot of bilateral and regional agreements, and through these bilateral and regional agreements, it is in fact also exporting, one could say, this model of EU's internal market governance to some degree to the rules outside of the European Union, but also more importantly, it has always been a strong supporter of multilateral trade regimes, and that's why, of course, and that's how, of course, the WTO comes into the picture as well. So this type of a rules-based trade regimes, the promotion of WTO has been one of the very explicit objectives of the EU all along. Moving towards then the WTO and EU's role there, I mean, EU itself has been a formal member since 1995. Commission there, as said, is the actor. That's the actual embodiment of EU within the institution. And if one thinks about the activities that take place in the WTO, one example are the dispute settlement cases, which take place within the WTO. Some statistics show that the EU has been raising 90 cases so far and intervening in 139 cases. That is between 1995 and this year. So that's quite a number. And one can see that this is maybe a way in which EU can be promoting the trade agenda, globally speaking. It takes action in the let's say in the judicial ways that the WTO offers. But it has also been the respondent in 77 cases. So it's not that we have perhaps all a clear conscience or a clear, how to say, well, that we also being blamed for being protectionist ourselves, and in 77 cases we've been asked to justify our actions within WTO's dispute settlement system. So all along, one can say that an active player, a big player, but perhaps then to look more to the future. Of course, times are changing in that trade-wise, simply from the perspective of trade volumes, EU's role is reducing because of the growth of Brazil, India, and China as trading nations. Their relative role in world trade is simply becoming much more prominent than it was before. So that is clearly reducing EU's role. And at the same time, and in particular, as Doha has been kind of going very slowly, the WTO's current trade round, the EU's own agenda has been moving perhaps more towards growth and the kind of trade agenda that actually also helps EU because of its own internal problems of having the economic slump. So it's trying to actually more perhaps than before use trade really as a means to growth, to really get out of the economic downturn, which has been really bothering and creating problems in the Union for the last 10 years already. The agenda, therefore, is one of looking into the markets that have most potential, really market access, really targeting markets with big potential, such as TTIP, etc., and those where maybe the level of protection also is not as high to begin with, so that the options or the possibilities of getting to results are better. One is looking into the regulatory issues and the non-tariff barriers, something which we will see in the EGA, in the Environmental Goods Agreement, is also a relevant point, as well as intellectual property rights and public procurement. So the agenda has been shifting towards these particular issues, and one could maybe therefore ask the question, so in this light, taking into account EU's diminishing, let's say, power, its new focus, how does the EGA play in that? Is that a sign, is that something new that the EU is it an example of the EU's new trade agenda, and in which ways? Let's see what we can conclude on that in a moment. Now, in terms of environment, very shortly, this is something which has evolved in the EU from its outset, from a marginal issue to a full-bodied express competence of the EU. It's a shared competence between the member states, which means that on the international fora, the European Union is conducting together with the member states agreements, which are called mixed agreements, in that both the Union and the member states can be parties. So in that sense, EU's role in the environmental international agenda is different, or in the international forum is different from its role in trade, where it is really the exclusive actor. Over the years, the competencies within the EU have been used to create a very comprehensive set of environmental law. We have a huge amount of environmental legislation in place, something which is moving from, let's say, processes and factories and the end-of-pipe type of environmental regulation more towards products and goods and end kind of point sources, consumption. And this is a relevant point to note, because indeed EGA can also be seen as in that light. It's an example of how also in the international forum this kind of point sources and that type of an environmental legislation is really becoming more important and prominent. Important to note also that EU's own agenda includes expressly also international environmental problems, so that that is covered by EU's agenda, and therefore it has become, and that partly explains EU's active role as a green normative power. It has taken a big stance on the international environmental treaties in many tens of MEAs, environmental agreements on the international forum. It also serves as a benchmark, so the level of legislation in the EU, the high level of standards in environment is creating an impact simply because it's creating a benchmark for others. REACH, for example, chemicals legislation is used in California, and again for EGA, for Environmental Goods Agreement, this may be relevant. We have high standards which can then be applied also in international treaties such as that. At the same time, as said, as an international actor, we've been, as Europeans, active in promoting different kinds of international collaboration, in particular multilateral arrangements for dealing with international environmental problems. But the same way as with trade, we seem to be coming to a phase where things may not be moving as smoothly. Let's hope that Paris works out. We'll maybe get a quick oversight of how things look like over there, and maybe the news are optimistic. But if one looks back at Copenhagen, that's seen as some kind of a touchy point in Europe's environmental agenda. It didn't quite work out the way we wanted, and in a way our leadership role has been a little bit questioned after that. China and US have been taking really on climate front actions in a way which have been pushing EU away from its usual leadership position. So really one can see also on the environmental front the growth of the same three operators, Brazil, India and China as well. So EGA can offer something there as well. Now, how do we combine these two agendas? Well, there are a lot of complicated relationships between trade and environment. One could say that trade law prevents or creates problems to environmental protection, because trade law can be used as a means to challenge environmental laws, and we have a lot of WTO cases on that, or at least some WTO cases on that. Shrimp, turtle, and tuna, dolphin, where environmental standards in the country have been challenged on the basis of trade law. So does trade prevent environmental protection? One can also ask the question in reverse and ask, well, environmental protection by creating new needs for new kinds of products, by raising the standards, can actually create economic activity and in fact increase trade in goods. So by raising the environmental standard, you create more knowledge and you create new products which can be exported. So exports actually increase because of increases in environmental protection. Potentially an interesting point for EGA. Trade can be used as a leverage to fight environmental standards, to force other partners to raise them. And one can also see a negative relationship in that, well, if trade creates more economic activity usually means more environmental impacts and therefore environmental harm. So even though your activities may be green and environmentally sustainable, more is still bad in that any consumption, even green consumption, is still consumption and creates environmental problems. So it cuts in many different ways. And overall, from a legal perspective, integration principle says that we'll try to at least integrate environmental protection into as many other policy fields as possible, including then, of course, also trade. Now, final slide, and I'm just handing over to Monica. But if one then focuses on trade and environment within the WTO, couple of points. First of all, sustainable development has become, it is in fact an objective of the WTO. This sometimes goes unnoticed. The trade organization does have, in fact, as its main objective or one of its objectives, sustainable development and environmental protection. Second, much of the treaties, or many of the treaties within WTO context, do have specific clauses that try to make sure that trade does not harm environment. There are these justification clauses in GATT, TBT, SPS agreements, and these are acronyms that relate to various kinds of WTO treaties. But the point here is simply that there are clauses in place which try to make sure that the environment does not get hurt because trade is being facilitated. Also, the dispute settlement cases have tended, in particular lately, to make sure that the trade agenda does not trump the environmental agenda. So that's on the level of the treaty clauses, how the trade and environmental agendas come together in WTO. There's also substantive developments in that a specific committee within the WTO, the Committee on Trade and Environment, is looking into this interrelationship, and it's looking into fields such as fisheries subsidies and into WTOs and MEAs, so multilateral environmental agreements, and it's trying to see how the WTO law can be developed so as to not to create problems with other international treaties in the field of environment. So trying to promote the coexistence of environmental treaties and trade treaties. And finally, in the Doha round itself, although it's going slow, there is an environmental agenda built into the development agenda itself, in that MEA, so multilateral environmental agreements, are specifically mentioned, as are environmental goods and services. And this, of course, leads to the EGA. So EGA epitomizes in WTO currently the way in which the trade and environmental agendas are coming together. But now I will be very glad to hand over to Monica, who will tell us in much more detail what exactly the EGA contains and what's the current status of the negotiations.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me. And sorry for being late. It's been a bit hectic indeed, because we had the 11th round of negotiation on environmental goods agreement last week in Geneva. Then I was heading to Paris, where we organized an event on EGA at the COP. And the very reason, of course, we did that is because we do see this as an agreement that serves a trade objective, but also serves a climate and environmental objectives. Often asked, is trade policy going to solve climate change? No, it's not going to solve. We hope that climate negotiations will reach indeed a good agreement, but it has a role to play and it can contribute. And it's exactly this sort of agreements like IGA that we think can be a very good contribution to the results of the climate change negotiation. Why? Because today, still many of the technologies that are needed to meet some of the ambitious targets that we all hope to agree are rather expensive and not necessarily widely available. And what trade agreements do, where trade agreements are best at cutting costs, that's their primary objectives. They also serve other glorious objectives like sustainable development, but the primary objective is to cut costs. If you make these products cheaper by cutting the tariff or non-tariff barriers on them, we hope that they will have a bigger uptake, and that, of course, will make it cheaper for companies and also governments, not to forget they have a role to play here, to meet some of the objectives. And the EU in itself has committed, irrespective of the climate negotiations in Paris, to meet very ambitious targets to improve its greenhouse gas emissions, to reduce them by 40% by 2030, to ensure that a significant share of our energy mix, I think 27% if I remember, comes from renewable energy, and that improve energy efficiency. So there was a question of, is this a new initiative or this is something we've been doing? Well, it has been a while since EU trade policy has tried to use all of its instruments to contribute to these broader objectives. We have indeed in the WTO under the DDA negotiation been trying to negotiate the liberalization of green goods and services. Unfortunately, those negotiations have not yet yielded results. We have also used the bilateral free trade agreements we have to front-load often the liberalization of these services and goods, which means that those are some of the first ones to be liberalized in our FTAs. And in a few occasions, we have negotiated what we call a green tech annexes. There is such in our Vietnam, EU-Vietnam, recent trade agreement, as well as in Singapore, that deal with some of the non-tariff barriers and try to remove them for the renewable energy sectors. So these are a few examples of how we have dealt with this in the multilateral fora, as well as in bilateral trade agreements. So what is IGA? Well, IGA is neither of those. IGA is a plurilateral agreement. It is negotiated between 70 members of the WTO, and one being the EU. I have brought some slides, but I think we try to just speak rather freely. But the idea came once APEC ministers, and is the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, in 2012 agreed among themselves on a political commitment to bring down the duties, so the custom duties, to 5% on 54 environmental goods. This was, if you wish, a small initiative, agreed at the political level. This is not bound in the WTO or trade law, but nevertheless was one of the first time that several countries agreed on what could be considered an environmental goods and agreed to actually reduce some of the costs of trading them. And so the EU took this opportunity to pursue its agenda it has been trying in the WTO to indeed negotiate the liberalization of environmental goods and services, and to bring this initiative back to the WTO. And so we joined this initiative with a number of other countries. Today we are 17, and we started to negotiate this plurilateral agreement. Negotiations were launched July 2014. Why is the EU doing that? I've already explained that there is an environmental objective. There is, of course, also a growth and an employment objectives. It was mentioned just before that today much growth is happening outside the EU, and of course we would like to capture that growth. Many jobs depend on exports, increasing number of jobs, and this sector, the green sector, is one on which the EU is leading exporter. It's also a leading importer, and it's one that has added and continued to add jobs even at the time of the economic crisis. So we want an agreement which is good for business and good for the environment. Interesting, the membership of this agreement. We see China for the first time ever joining a plurilateral initiative from the outset. we do hope one day other BRICS, I think you call them, Brazil, India, and China, other countries, emerging economies, will also come to the table. That's not the case today, but it is indeed extremely significant that China, which is the second biggest exporter and importer of some of these goods, just after the EU, wants to be part of this initiative. Of course, again, they have a trade objective, but they also have an environmental objectives, and I don't know if you've been reading the news, but China for the first time has put a red alert given the air pollution in Beijing. I spent 2 years living and working in Beijing, so I can confirm it can get really, really bad. And indeed, it is the Chinese government's commitment, as they have reached a certain level of development, to make things better. It is a plurilateral agreement, but it's one that is open to other countries to join. We really do hope that more countries will come on board. We've had Israel, Turkey, and Iceland join this agreement. We do hope that more Asian, Latin American, and African countries will come on board. And in any case, whether they join or not, what is important to know, this is an MFN-based agreement. What does it mean? It means that the reduction of duties we will negotiate will apply to all WTO members. So you could ask, why join then? If I can benefit from something without me joining, if the EU will lower its tariffs also to a country that is not participating, why join? And interestingly enough, the best answer I heard so far was from the ambassador of Costa Rica, which is a developing country, which is very, very green, that has a target to have all of its energy from renewable sources. And he said, when we joined ITA, and I think you had a discussion here about information technology agreement already, we didn't actually produce any information technology, but we joined a liberalization of trade agreement. We then, of course, put money into education and training of IT engineers. We adopted a number of domestic and external policies, and today we are a major exporter of IT services and goods. We want to do the same here with IGA. So we don't export this today in large quantities, but we do think there could be a future potential. We also want to be able to import. We want to lower our tariffs to be able to get cheaper these technologies. And with global value chains, to be honest, export and import doesn't matter so much. This is for economists to crunch numbers. What matters is that you join the club and you participate in this economy. What are we aiming at? We are aiming at full elimination of tariffs to bring them to zero. We're aiming at an agreement that will enlarge the 54 goods to a longer list of products. We want to make it a future-oriented agreement. An environmental goods agreement cannot be static. There are new technologies, often coming from SMEs. We need to be open to add them. And we also would like to address other issues. I think there was a mention of services and NTBs. These are important elements. We want to go pragmatic, step by step. We will start probably with the goods, but we will add services and NTBs as well. Where are we today? Today we are at the 11th round of the negotiations. We have on the table at this stage 360 goods. Originally there were 650 nominated by the 70 members, and these are along 10 environmental and climate categories. I have brought a brochure that we actually just produced for the Monday event that shows concrete examples of the EU's product nominations. You may have heard that we are trying to increase our transparency in the Commission, so we have put forward here some of the goods that the EU is pushing for in these negotiations. Of course, they not all will be agreed. There are some other members who would prefer other products. Our objectives are mainly on the renewable energy sector and water management, wastewater management. These are our priorities. We think they are indeed extremely important. How did we come up with this list of goods? And I think here it is important to recognize that, of course, we are trade experts. We are not environment, but by now I know more than I ever wanted to know about some of these technologies. Google is my friend, but so are international experts. So what we've done in this negotiation, and that was rather, I think, unprecedented, we spent this first 6 months of inviting people from outside into the negotiations room. So we had a number of international organizations, we had business associations, we had national regulators, institutes, standardization institutes, NGOs who came and talked about these environmental categories. And then what we tried to do is to understand how does a wastewater management plan work, and what are the goods and services that form part, and how does that translate to a custom code, which is what we are talking about. We are talking about customs number. The biggest difficulty, of course, is to come up with a definition. I'm sure professors spent a lot of time writing papers of what is an environmental good. Yeah. But indeed, it's extremely difficult. In an ideal world, we will do a life cycle assessment. And the EU is working on an environmental footprint technology, DG Environment. It's in its pilot phase, in which we also involved other countries along several industries to trying to come up with a unified methodology for the future. But today, unfortunately, there is no such internationally accepted methodology. So instead, what we focus here is what is rather simpler, is environmental use. So we look at goods and products because they are used in an environmental application. We, in a trade negotiation today, are unable to reflect of how they are made or how they are transported. We often get these questions, and I always say that's the future. In an ideal world, we will be there. Today, we are not there. It's a negotiation that has to base itself on internationally existing methodologies and standards. We also think if a good can be good for more purposes, it has a bigger chance to be included. It has to be part of a system. We focus mainly on the industrial goods, but consumer goods, of course, have a role to play. So I've brought a few pictures just to demonstrate that we are covering very basic products like polysilicon, which is, I believe, a raw material, but also much more sophisticated like PV modules. Wind sector is very important, and this is an example of a gearbox which is very expensive. It's 30% of a windmill, and we would like to make it cheaper. Very simple things you have when you bring your garbage outside to your garden, a waste container, up to machinery that is needed. Oil skimmers, these are machines that, applications that clean an oil after an oil spill. This is my building where I work on. It has very good isolation. Otherwise, I would get nuts because Rue de la Loi is under me. Double glazed windows, different insulation technologies, heat pumps that heat your house in the winter and warm it using the warmth of the earth that was warmed up by the sun. Thermostats, I think this is the product that most families debate because everybody has a different view of what the right temperature should be. But it is one of the products that is causing a lot of family conflict, but we hope. I was in Beijing recently, and I made this presentation. I was very surprised that they don't use it at their homes at all. It's something used in hotels, but it's not a widespread technology there. But they are looking now in the new buildings to also install it. This is a very simple product, a water pump, but we should not forget that this agreement is open to all countries, and some countries having access to a very simple water pump can save lives. These were the easy products. Now, what is happening is that there are a number of products that are, of course, environmentally preferable. Now, what is environmentally preferable? We could probably have a long discussion. Is a bicycle better than an electric bike better than an electric car? We could have a debate about that, but indeed some members have put forward environmentally preferable products. For instance, waterless urinals. Apparently they are at Zaventem Airport, but in a male bathroom, so I've never been able to verify. They use a certain biodegradable chemical instead of water, and there are some calculations of the water they could save is indeed significant should they be adopted. Where are we now? Well, as I mentioned, we have agreed on a number of products that we are discussing. This list will be probably further focused. We spent most of the first part on environmental credibility, each of us explaining, bringing experts, and now it's more moving to traditional trade negotiations, of course, where we are trying to see, exchange, and have a balanced agreement, a balance in terms of environmental impact, but also to ensure that everybody's priorities are included. We have made more progress than any other trade agreement, I think, in a short time. And then I think it's not thanks to our great work, it's thanks to the fact that we are indeed in a unique year. We had the SDGs, the Sustainability Development Goals agreed. There are the climate negotiations, and there is the WTO ministerial, all happening at the same time. So there is a political will at the very top. We hear Obama talking about climate change. We heard China talking about climate change. The EU has been talking for climate change, and we will continue to be at the forefront. We are not there yet. However, we will, I think, need a few more rounds. We really hope that next year we can bring this to a conclusion in terms of IGA 1. Once this is agreed, of course, it will go to the European Parliament. You mentioned the Parliament now has a bigger role in trade negotiations. They have just set up a monitoring group as well because they are very interested. How do we engage with the outside world where we attend lectures like this and we find them very useful, so I'm looking forward to a discussion. We also have a sustainability impact assessment that is ongoing on which anybody can comment, because you made a comment, is more trade polluting the environment or can it be beneficial on the environment? And of course it all depends, and this is why we do this rigorous sustainability impact assessment that, by the way, not only look at the environment but also social issues, labor rights, human rights, and broader aspects. So I would like to thank you with that, and just to say that indeed we believe that this agreement will not only help environment and climate and trade, but it also can strengthen the WTO. The WTO system is still the most important forum to negotiate. We are in negotiations with many, many countries bilaterally, but our strong preference would be indeed to have a multilateral trading system that is delivering results. And this sort of plurilaterals, however, I call them open plurilaterals because they are MFN based, can indeed strengthen the WTO, and therefore they also have what we call a systemic value if we succeed.
Thank you very much, Monica. That's a very good overview of the environmental goods agreement, indeed. And maybe just to continue right from where you left it, because this issue about the multilateralism and bilateralism, as mentioned in both fields, is topical. And what you mention is interesting, because what you're saying, in fact, is that this preference for multilateral agreements remains in place. So can you maybe just start off by reflecting a little bit, how do you see that expanding to other countries? Is it about through the product scope that brings in the Costa Ricas and other countries, that you need to find the products that take them into the negotiations, or what's the mechanism in a way?
I mean, so the agreement is open for other countries to come in and join. We keep it transparent. We regularly report to the committee you mentioned, the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment, of the state of play, and ensure that any other WTO member, if they are interested, they can learn more about it. We have also reached out actively to a number of countries that we believe are leaders in this field, or the future leaders. We have organized a number of workshops and events in Latin America and also Asia. I would hope that countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam are going to be countries that will come on board from Asia. I also believe that Chile, Mexico, Colombia, in that region could show leadership. And I would not underestimate the opportunity of also having an African member, and Kenya, where the ministerial will be, would be a good candidate. The question for them is how and when to join, I think. First of all, I think many of them see the opportunity, as I said, this is an opportunity to become part of global governance and get recognition for that. So the discussions are at the political level, environmental ministry, trade ministry. There is also a question for countries who already have very low tariffs. Some of these countries, like Chile, are very liberal trade regime, whether there is a point for them to further cut or even participate. But they, for instance, see the value of the services element. So I think the services element is very interesting for some developing countries, because it also means knowledge and engineer and consulting services in this area are being more accessible. And then last but not least, as I mentioned, it's a living agreement. So you would have to sign up. If you join at the time when it's already agreed upon, you still can join, by the way, tomorrow if you want to. Then you would probably have to accept the negotiated outcome, but you could bring your own product, and we are thinking of a 3 to 5 years discussion review mechanism where additional products can be added, and so that would allow them to bring their priority products.
So essentially any country joining can bring along its favorite environmental goods into the agreement scope, which would be a good incentive, of course, to join.
Yes.
It's interesting because I know from having talked to Joachim Reiter, who I said regrettably was not here tonight on this very point, and he said interestingly that even for developing countries, there are surprisingly for those that do not follow it as closely as he does, niche areas where in fact the environmental standards are quite high, and they are in fact able to develop niche products because of the high environmental standards. So like you said, there may be a way to actually use the EGA to get some developing countries along into the development through this mechanism. And I think that's a very positive prospect in general to think of.